And good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for a special edition of Watch Fox News Digital here at King Day at the Dome. I'm Friendy Clairvaux.
Brian McConkey, glad to be here, Friendy. An important day. A day of service, a day of remembrance, right. And a day of celebration for achievements that have been made. But as we'll hear today, there always is a message of hope and a message of moving the path forward.
You're right about that. And moving the path forward, starting here at the State House, King Day at the Dome. This event has a lot of history, Brian. It's not something that just started haphazardly or it started last year, for instance.
No, not at all, not at all. We did have a couple-year break, though, during the pandemic. We did not have the in-person rallies. Last year, of course, they did return with several hundred people marching here at the State House. But this goes back a quarter century. Yeah. This goes back to the to Y2K, to the year 2000, when there was a solitary purpose for it. Flag, the Confederate flag that flew here at the State House since the early 60s, 1961, at one point on top of the dome.
That's right.
And then after that initial rally, it was moved. Now, we looked back at the history of why this rally was created. It has become a lot of different calls to action over the years.
Exactly.
But in the very beginning, it was about the Confederate flag, and we want to take a look back at that right now.
No justice!
The King Day at the Dome rally we know today was something different a quarter century ago when it launched. A colossal call to action. Nearly 50,000 people marching on the State House, demanding lawmakers remove the Confederate flag. Months later, in May of 2000, a plan was passed to take the flag off its prominent perch on the State House dome, where it'd flown since 1961, and place it along Gervais Street after years of battling over the issue.
Take it down! Take it down!
However, that move didn't end the fight for the flag's complete removal. It remained a significant talking point in King Day rallies, but focus also shifted to issues like education, the criminal justice system, racial justice, and access to health care. It also became a destination spot for political candidates.
I'm talking about the moral deficit.
Eventual President Barack Obama speaking at the rally during his run to the White House in 2008. Ever since, political hopefuls have been sure to make their voices heard at the rally during critical election years.
Take it down now.
The push that would bring down the Confederate flag for good was sparked by one of this state's darkest days in 2015. 9 black church members, including State Senator Clementa Pinckney, gunned down during a Bible study at the historic Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston in June of that year by avowed white supremacist Dylan Roof. Pictures surfaced of Roof draped in the Confederate battle flag, kickstarting a push that would remove the flag for good.
It's enough when you say enough is enough.
And much of that debate playing out on State House grounds for weeks, with people on every side of the issue coming to Columbia.
This flag above me, it represents every soldier in South Carolina, both black and white.
Take it down!
We want the flag down. We're tired of these platitudes that we've been hearing for the last 50 years.
If this racism and oppression is who we are, then leave the flag up. But if not, then it's time that we take a stand and do something different.
This is everybody's heritage, not just white people's heritage. This is black people's heritage, Mexican heritage. Anyone that lived in America, is their heritage too.
It's time to move the flag from the Capitol ground.
By July, lawmakers had put together a plan to remove the flag from the grounds and place it in a museum. It was quickly signed into law by then-Governor Nikki Haley.
With that, I am proud to say that the bill has been signed.
The very next day, July 10th, 2015, history playing out in Columbia. When a state honor guard took down what had become a divisive part of the state's history as thousands in attendance looked on, many overwhelmed by what they saw.
When someone looks at someone a different color, I think in their head they will think something different now.
While there have been strong feelings on both sides, we'll just grow stronger from this work and come closer together.
We fought for this flag to come down for a very long time now. It shows us that we can win a victory, and it inspires us to continue fighting.
After years of activists pushing for the flag to permanently be removed, that part of the fight was over. The initial reason the King Day rally started. Civil rights leaders have celebrated the flag's removal in King Day at the Dome rallies ever since, and the rally still remains an important call to action for equality and racial justice.
Such a powerful piece there, Brian. Well put together, trying to let everyone know exactly the history and how this event here is just a powerful event.
How we got to where we're standing today. And this rally is never going to be going away. As you can see, we've added to our conversation now Dr. Todd Shaw from the University of South Carolina, to our programming here at WACH Fox. This has always been an important day, here and everywhere around this country. As we stand here today, about to hear from the Vice President in the next couple of hours, it speaks to that, doesn't it? How important this rally has been.
Yes, it speaks to the way in which South Carolina history is American history. And an important and vital component of South Carolina history is African American history and civil rights history. And so when the organizers, almost 25 years ago, decided, particularly with the NAACP conference and others, decided that they would use King's birthday as an event that King would approve of, to make a stand, to serve others, to talk to justice. That speaks to why there are multiple, King's the observance of his birthday, but of his legacy and the observance of what happened relative to his birthday almost 25 years ago.
Not know about the genesis of how this came about. It's important for all of us to know about that history as this mission gets pushed forward.
It is, and so as the piece delved into very nicely, the whole reason in part for this rally was for the removal of the Confederate flag from the State House dome. Unfortunately, the call wasn't heeded very soon enough, and Dylan Roof used it as a symbol of hate in order for that terrible massacre at Mother Emanuel Church. But as a result, the Governor Haley and other members of the legislature who were lobbying decided to take it off the dome, and not only to take it off the dome, but then to remove it completely. From front of the State House. And so, in some respects, it's both sort of the pain but the victory of what happens on a day like this.
And especially now that the flag has been removed, Dr. Shaw, there's still a contention about the history and about it being part of South Carolina history. Kind of speak to that, about that position where so many people feel that this is part of South Carolina.
The day is part of South Carolina, but it's also the way in which we've got to observe the difficulties of our history. On the State House grounds are monuments both to histories of victory, but histories of divide, of segregation. And so that's sort of, and I am one who would argue that monuments should be commemorated. You should remember the history. You don't necessarily celebrate the pain. You don't celebrate the divide and the inequality, but you remain mindful, because King would want us to not gloss over the history and pretend as though the struggle isn't real and there's still not a struggle ahead of us.
When speaking about history, one of the events here that begins at the King Day of the Dome is the March at Zion Baptist Church. And Zion Baptist Church has been a historical a focal point here in Columbia. And as a matter of fact, today there's a prayer service that will begin at about 8:30. Well, it started already.
It's underway. It's already underway.
Exactly. And so we kind of wanted to give everybody a brief history of Zion Baptist Church as to why that church has become the focal point of King Day at the Dome.
Zion was the focal point. If it was a civil rights movement, march, Zion was the one.
Deacon Isaac Washington has been a member of Zion Baptist Church since he was a child. He currently serves as a deacon and is the church's historian. He tells me Zion's notoriety developed thanks in part to their former pastor, James P. Reeder, who served Zion from 1929 to 1961.
Zion had its congregation was so diversified. Man, they had doctors, they had lawyers, they had principals, they had architects.
Pastor Reeder used his clout as a member of the National Baptist Convention to help the congregation realize that they were self-sufficient and that they were a beacon of hope during a segregated South. Washington says after Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi after falsely being accused of whistling at a white woman, everything changed for Zion.
Emmett Till was 14, I was 13. And I remember getting together. I remember coming down to Zion, and I had all these the people, and that was the first time I remembered that Zion kind of got together.
Since then, the 1,500-member congregation was the prime spot speaking out against racial injustice. Photos showing civil rights activists like Rosa Parks and Shirley Chisholm coming to Zion. Washington says Zion was poised to meet a powerful voice during the civil rights movement.
MLK was to come to Columbia. He was scheduled to come to Columbia. And the garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, called him, and said, man, we need you here right now. But his destination was Columbia. His destination was Zion Baptist Church.
But Dr. King never made it back to Columbia. He was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Tennessee. The church's remarkable history setting the stage for them to eventually be the starting point for King Day at the Dome, which began as a cry to remove the Confederate flag from the State House dome.
As you can see, the Confederate flag has been moved. So in some ways we have advanced, but in some ways we have went backwards.
Dr. Melvin Andrew Davis is the senior pastor of Zion Baptist. He says he's glad to know the church's history cannot be erased.
Zion Baptist Church partnered with Dr. Bobby Donaldson and USC to make sure that we document our history downtown.
Dr. Davis says the fight for justice continues in South Carolina.
The late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Once said that the church is not just a place of worship, but it's a place that feels the heartbeat of the community. And we must be concerned about social justice and racial equality.
And speaking of the heartbeat of the community, as we mentioned a few moments ago, a breakfast getting underway in prayer service at Zion Baptist Church, and that's where we have our Jake Holman, who is out there. So Jake, kind of give us the layout of the land. What can you tell us what's happening right now?
To every good work.
Yeah, Freddie, Columbia has already kicked off their celebrations and services for Martin Luther King Day, beginning right here at the Zion Baptist Church in Columbia, where several hundreds are gathered inside. As a matter of fact, the service is continuing right now, and I can take a look right here. There is another several hundred, few hundred likely, standing outside right here outside the service, listening in to what they're talking about. But as we know, this church has been a staple in this community, and this service has been an annual prayer service in Columbia for decades now, and the people of the Midlands continue to show up and to show out in remembrance of Martin Luther King. The keynote speaker for today's service is the minority leader from the U.S. House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries. Now, Kamala Harris is also expected to be in the capital city today, talking at the King Day at the Dome at the State House later this morning. Now, while the people of Columbia continue their prayer service inside this church, those that are in attendance feel it's important to celebrate year in and year out.
Celebrates the life and times of a great person, a great historian that's very, very important to American history. A person that stood for peace for everyone. And anytime you have someone that did the magnificent things that he did in the United States for civil rights, you always want to commend those individuals and celebrate everything they've actually done.
Now, this service is, again, just the first of many celebrations and events that are going to play out later this day. But immediately following this ceremony, dozens will gather outside the church here and march to the State House, where, again, like we mentioned, Vice President Kamala Harris is expected to be there today at the King Day at the Dome at the State House. And that is all expected to begin at about 10:30 this morning. Now I'm live here in Columbia. Jake Holman, Watch Fox News, local first.
All right, Jake, thank you so much for that. We are back here live with Dr. Shaw here from USC, and we were talking about just a few moments ago the historic Zion Baptist Church, where the march will begin today, where everyone's going to meet there and come over here. So, Dr. Shaw, the church's role when it comes to the civil rights has always been an important one.
It has, and the church and African American communities historically have been both spiritual institutions, first and foremost, but civic and social institutions. And so it's the church where folk would gather in, when possible, in the days prior to freedom, but certainly in the era of the 20th century in the civil rights movement. Here in South Carolina, AME churches, the Baptist churches have been key, and particularly those pastors and ministers who could have the degree of independence to be social activists. So in many ways, Zion Baptist is historic in all the ways in which it has produced sort of drum majors, if you will, for justice.
Even now, it still plays that critical role. Certainly it's evolved over time,
That's right.
but this is a rallying point. We
That's
see
right.
so many elected leaders appear at churches, speak to people. We had the president, Joe Biden, in Charleston, again, at the site of what, in my opinion, is one of the darkest days in this state's history, speaking there, and that sent a message as well.
It does, and I think in some ways the church, even though we have a larger discussion about the relevance of the church, are individuals going to church or being unchurched, still it is a vital point for gathering for freedom and information. It's a way in which, in subtle ways, you can speak to voters. In many respects, the church is still very much needed, and its social relevance and political relevance still stands very much true today.
As a matter of fact, earlier we had a chance to speak with a pastor from Blythewood who himself was part of the civil rights movement, and he's been pastoring for over 40 years, and he talked to us about what you had to say, too, about how church was a pivotal point of the civil rights movement. Here's that story.
It was probably natural for the movement to grow out of the church.
Pastor Eddie Davis has been the pastor of Little Zion Baptist Church in Blythewood for 41 years. He says during the civil rights movement, the church was the heartbeat of the African American community.
During that period of time, the community was built on three pillars: the family, the church, and the schools. And the church was central to our gathering and discussions concerning just about anything that was going on in the community.
Pastor Davis says he recalls standing up for justice during the movement.
Well, it took courage because the atmosphere of the nation was tremendously violent and against the African American community speaking out. And so you had to be bold enough to take a stand for what was right.
Pastor Davis says during the time of segregation, it was difficult for African Americans to feel heard and appreciated, so church was the place where they felt noticed.
That's where you looked for solutions to social problems. That was the only place that the community could go, and we expected our religious leaders to have answers to some of the social questions. And so it was natural then for the community to galvanize around a pastor.
He says this is one of the many reasons the church rallied around a then prominent reverend called Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
You can't preach the gospel without dealing with social issues. That's what we're dealing with, the culture and some of the problems and issues that we deal with as people, general, all over the world, comes from our culture. And so the church has to meet that challenge because a lot of the cultural issues is in conflict with what we believe as Christians.
Dr. King used the Bible to demonstrate the importance of righteousness, justice, and the sanctity of life.
He was actually not more than a social leader, or we like to call him a drum major for justice, but he was also a general that was leading an army, into battle without any weapons to fight with except love, peace, courage, faith, and commitment.
Pastor Davis says as a leader, he knows that Dr. King would have mixed feelings about the state of our nation.
And one of the things that I think that he would be displeased with is the dissolution of the family. See, the family structure has basically fallen apart, and that's why we see so much trouble and struggle in our communities.
Pastor Davis says he's forever grateful to Dr. King for his courageous spirit.
To be frank with you, had he not stood up and fought the way that he did, we wouldn't be the people that we are right now.
Pastor Davis says although times have changed, the church still remains the light of the community.
Now, the church is not a building. It is the people that worship God, that have been delivered from their sins and who proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord. We make up the church. The building is just a building.
But that's not the case with the lady. There you have it there, Pastor Eddie Davis from Zion Baptist Church there, speaking with us about the importance of the church's rights. And we have so much more this morning to talk about.
We do. There are a lot of pieces, things that happen here on these roads, happen throughout the streets. Zion Baptist Church that we've already visited this morning. But a big part of this is always, a big rallying point has also been the Columbia Urban League. They do an annual breakfast that is so widely attended. It truly is. I think all of us have been there at one point or another. And it is an important place, again, to send a message of service, of honoring a legacy and of moving forward, is it not?
And the Columbia Urban League, the National Urban League, has been a vital component of the civil rights movement. And was sort of part of what was called the Big Six back in Dr. King's day, of those civil rights organizations that come together. And this is really about a gathering under a broader umbrella of social justice. And I think those are the messages we have to send in legacy to Dr. King, because he wanted no monuments built to him per se. But he did say, serve me with service. He wanted that to be his legacy. And I think the Urban League and the NAACP and other vital organizations, of course, are carrying on that legacy.
That is really the event that opens this day, at least in Columbia. Starts before 8 o'clock. And we have our Marshari Adams. She is live at the site of this year's breakfast, where presumably at this point has wrapped up. But we're going to go to Masharia now for a snapshot of what was happening there today. Masharia.
He was nominated by 2 presidents.
Friendy, lots of notable community leaders and organizations are here at Brooklyn Baptist to celebrate the legacy of Dr. King. I mean, I've seen people from all walks of life. I've seen Senator Devine, I've seen Chief Holbrook, and I've seen Superintendent Ellen Weaver, all here to celebrate his legacy. The theme for this year's breakfast is the beloved community promotes opportunity and inclusion for all, and former Governor David Beasley will be the keynote speaker during the breakfast. I spoke with the president of the Columbia Urban League, J.T. McLaughlin, and he says this breakfast is all about fostering the community that Dr. King fought for.
Dr. King talked about a beloved community. That's what we're talking about today. If you have a beloved community, you're going to have a community where people work together, support each other. And you will have diversity, equity, and inclusion.
In his acceptance speech delivered in Oslo, Norway on December 10th, 2021.
Live in Columbia, Masharia Adams, Watch Fox News, Local First.
Working with 100.
And that was our Masharia Adams there at the Columbia Urban League at the breakfast there this morning, talking about the importance of the events and, leading up to why we're here today at King Day at the Dome.
It is such an important event. I mean, Governor David Beasley was the keynote speaker there this morning. A man who, if we look back in history, was one of the first to call, from a political standpoint at least, to call for the removal of the flag in the 90s. And that, of course, the follow-through didn't come until almost 2 decades later.
Yeah, this is true. And in some ways, we're reminded of Dr. King's quote about, that the universe moves slowly when it comes to justice, but the arc bends toward justice in the long stretch of history. And so that's difficult when you're in the midst of a struggle, in this particular struggle, talking about the removal of the Confederate flag. But eventually, even after some pain and sorrow, there's victory that comes from it. So, and that's a key aspect of social movement and political movements.
Governor Beasley now heads up the World Food Program, so has moved on to certainly some big endeavors since his service to this state, for sure.
And before we were talking about the Urban League, you did mention something, Dr. Shaw, about Dr. King's, the Big Six, I believe. That's what you talked about. Right. Let's delve into that just a little bit more for individuals who need to know what he was talking about.
So the civil rights movement was so complex that Dr. King, among many others, knew that there was a need for coordination among organizations. From his organization, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but the NAACP had a definite legal and other roles to play. The Urban League, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so there wasn't always agreement among civil rights leaders because, of course, they were up to a difficult task of taking on segregation and pushing for social justice and civil rights. But they did come together, they did coordinate at times, even with these disagreements. And so we have to be mindful that although we celebrate the unity of what came from their efforts, they had to debate among themselves at times to come to some level of agreement about how to move forward.
And speaking of that, coming to that level of agreement, not everyone wanted the nonviolent approach. There were some individuals that were looking at Dr. King, were saying, this is not the way that we want to move forward. Is that correct?
That's right. And that's actually an aspect of how movements change and how movements even sometimes they are, I should be careful to say, but sort of victims of their own success. So after the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act were signed into law, there became the question of what is next. And so the younger activists, particularly within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, began to ask the question, how do we, in fact, continue to move forward given the sort of entrenched nature of segregation? And even before then, individuals like Malcolm X and what would emerge to be the Black Power movement disagreed with King directly about nonviolent resistance. And King, at his times, he struggled because he saw the violence going on in places, particularly like Vietnam. And so it wasn't easy to maintain his nonviolent resistance stance and philosophy, and it certainly became even more difficult after King's death in 1968.
We are going to hear from quite a few people here at the State House once things get underway here a little after 10 o'clock, almost 24 speakers. But what you see on the program, the theme, every year there is a theme here. This year, ballots for freedom, ballots for justice, ballots for change is the theme that is on this year's program for the annual King Day at the Dome rally. We're going to hear from a lot of people, but I think we're still going to hear a unified message. What are you expecting to maybe hear from anyone who speaks today to galvanize this crowd?
Well, I think there are several things that individuals can speak to today. We're in the midst of a presidential election year, and that's to be noted. Of course, the Iowa caucuses are going on as we speak today for the Republicans. And then we have, again, the observance of King Day, of the commemoration of how, again, King wanted no monuments per se to him. He wanted a legacy of service, and that's why we know this is a day of service, not a day off, as we would say. And then you have to speak to the moment of South Carolina and our history. Again, as I said earlier, South Carolina history is American history. You have to know South Carolina to know aspects of American history quite well. From days of enslavement to the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, just aspects of it. So there's lots that speakers could say today and still speak to the multiple moments we're in right now.
The Vice President being here certainly is a substantial situation for the rally. Speaks to the importance of it. It really does. But this has become a rallying place, a campaign stop for so many people over the years. If we think back, even going back 15 years or so, still wasn't the president yet, but eventual President Barack Obama spoke here in 2008. And after that, certainly rode a wave of support to the White House for a couple of terms. This has become the spot for people to come. Everybody comes through. It's amazing.
It is. And South Carolina has yet another aspect of making history. We might argue that Barack Obama's campaign wouldn't have had the pep that it needed, the launch that it needed, particularly against the very formidable candidacy of Hillary Clinton, were it not for South Carolina, and were it not for sort of the ways in which South Carolina sort of pushed his campaign forward in that Democratic primary. And some would argue that Barack Obama had to sort of demonstrate that he was presidential material, and South Carolinians and voters, particularly Democratic and black voters, sort of, were looking at him and gave some thoughts, particularly, given Iowa, given New Hampshire. But once he gained momentum, Then South Carolina became pivotal, and particularly the black vote in South Carolina became pivotal to his eventual success in 2007, 2008.
You know, one thing you mentioned, but we always see her talking about, the first in the South primary, South Carolina. Those who may be watching for the first time, kind of understand, what is it about South Carolina that typically picks presidents?
You know, we're sort of a crossroads of America in many respects. The fact that, yes, we are a state that leans conservative or Republican, but we do have a mix of sort of Democratic and Republican divides in this state. There are divides within the parties themselves, and that's reflected in South Carolina. South Carolina, we know parts of our history. We were the first to succeed from the Union, and so in many respects we punched a little bit above our weight given our population, but it's a crossroads also of African American history. You really cannot know African American history unless you know South Carolina. So as I tell my students, in some ways you can almost dig your fingers down into the soil of South Carolina and find history. That's how important we are in many respects, and knowing that history, not just 200 or plus years ago, but knowing the present and contemporary history is quite key. And presidential candidates, Republican and Democratic, use this state as a launching board for candidacies in key ways, given the demographics and the importance of voters in our state.
One point, going back to Brian's point, Brian talked about today the theme, a balance for freedom, balance for justice, balance for change. Earlier today, one of the speakers, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, a lot of individuals could have come down to South Carolina. What do you think specifically about him that made him poised to come to Zion to speak this morning?
Well, the highest-ranking Democratic leader in the House of Representatives coming is not a small point. I think I'll say, even given the nonpartisan nature of aspects of what's going on today, there's clearly ways in which the Democratic leaders are trying to think about, well, how can we once again use South Carolina as a launching board? And I think what's happening today at the King Day stands in contrast is a point of contrast to what's happening with the Republican leadership and the Republican candidates in Iowa. And so I think, there's sort of, it's important to send a signal, particularly given that President Biden made such a strong statement with regards to South Carolina being first in the Democratic primary process. So I think Leader Jeffries is coming to reinforce that point in many ways.
You spoke to his political profile rising, for sure. There's a very real possibility he could become Speaker of the House at some point if Democrats were to take control there, especially because of some of the infighting that's been going on within the parties right now. So, yes, excellent points that, again, this could be used as that particular springboard for someone to raise their profile to a more national level in a lot of ways. This is also used to launch a lot of initiatives. A lot of pushes for change, like it says, balance for change. Every year we hear about education here. It is something that's so hotly debated each and every year within the walls of this state house. And not enough money goes to it. Everyone knows that. Right. Everyone knows that. That's not Republican or Democrat. Right, that is something we all know. We've all gone to school. Exactly. We know the job that educators do. Right. Again, there are educators that are slated to speak today. Mm-hmm. That is so important to everyone that comes here.
It is indeed, and I think it also speaks to the fact that education encompasses such a broad range of issues. Teachers, in the hundreds rallied here, several years ago with regards to teacher pay. We have the broader question that we're raising in various places, and the sort of majorities and the minority party in the State House are debating about this question around transparency and integrity, with that law being passed and being signed by the governor. What does it mean about parent accountability, but also what does it mean about teaching about questions of race and history and gender and various other subjects in the school? We have the discussion, with regards to what do we mean by diversity. So these are all hotly contested issues. Educators will speak today about, I'm sure, the broader issues about how what we're doing serve in the curriculum that we're projecting, serving the interests of students and serving the interests of parents and families, and how do we give students quality educations given also some of the disparities that still exist. We talk about the corridor of shame in this state. So how do we close those disparities and gaps that exist with regards to the education of children?
Some fair points there, absolutely good. And we're speaking about those speakers, Brian. We're talking about the educational aspect of things. Yeah. Also for voting rights. That's another important thing, that, especially here in South Carolina, there's always been a contention about voting rights, IDs, no IDs, back and forth. Speak to that history and why that is a major issue for so many people.
Yeah, so it's again a debated point among the parties as to how do you guarantee voter integrity but voter access. In South Carolina, we're kind of middling in terms of the range of things and we might say restrictions that we ask for. We're not as restrictive as some of our sister southern states in terms of what's required or what's even necessary in order for, if you've been convicted of a felony, to gain your right to vote again. But there is a history. I mean, that's part of the civil rights movement. That was a critical issue of the civil rights movement. Because Dr. King, among others, certainly felt that if you don't have the right to vote, how are you in fact a full citizen in the United States? That's the measure of indicating citizenship, is the right to be part of the democratic process. So we in South Carolina, the debate continues on. There are ways in which we ask this question also about how do we draw these districts, and are these districts gerrymandered? Or gerrymandered, or are they fairly apportioned? There's a whole range, there's a whole course we could teach on voting rights.
We could do six specials on that.
Six specials on voting rights and civil rights in South Carolina. And we've been a critical part of that movement because we have various ways in which we have commemorated, and I say we have commemorated the Columbia 63 and other projects have commemorated the protest that students even had many decades ago around the State House asking for the end of segregation and the broader question about the fair franchise in the vote. So all of these things are present and continue to be debated among the parties, but critical issues for citizens, of course.
When we talk about the voting issue and the access to the ballot box, the old-timey ballot box, we'll go back to that particular phrase. Do you see some barriers falling? Because we now do have some expanded early voting.
That's right.
Something those were dirty words for many years in this state, even using the term early voting. It's more expanded absentee voting at this point. Do you think this will be the first major, big election that we will have? The primaries, then of course the presidential next November, we'll have early voting available. Do you think that's going to play an even bigger role in turnout? Could it?
It could indeed, and there are ways in which early voting, certainly we know from the data, is employed by older Americans, and so we could see that early vote being critical to, if individuals have limited mobility and for a range of issues, that being key. Early voting was also sort of, or aspects of early voting, I should say, were key in 2020. But you're right, in this presidential election, it will truly matter as to the ways in which it is a launching place for voters to turn out in larger numbers. Black churches have also employed this, and there's been debates about this use of the notion of souls to the polls in southern states. And that souls to the polls is again reflecting the way in which the church is key, at least mobilizing individuals to exercise their right to vote. The church didn't tell you who to vote for, nonpartisan, but it tells you to vote. And so we'll see, because again, the data does reveal older Americans, among others, have used that expanded ballot access. And they're a key voting bloc, anyone running for office will tell you.
Some of the other things, too, Brian, that we're talking about when we're here, King Day at the Dome, we're talking about Dr. King's legacy. You mentioned his service, his spirit, what he stood for. And, ever since his assassination, many communities have had a variety of awards to give out to community activists, to civil rights leaders. And this past weekend, actually, someone from the South Carolina Highway Patrol received a medallion award, an MLK Drum Major Medallion Award, and he had an historic appointment as well, and he's actually the colonel of the South Carolina Highway Patrol. Here's that story.
And so as we promote people, we want to get them in the position of going through this First Line Leadership Academy.
Colonel Christopher Williamson is the commander of the South Carolina Highway Patrol. He is responsible for nearly 800 troopers. He's been in charge since 2016, and his history-making appointment was something he didn't see coming. He's the first African American to hold this position.
Friendly, I never thought I'd be reach this rank within the Highway Patrol, but I can actually attest to the fact that in any career, if you are dedicated to it and you put your mind to it, you will be successful.
Colonel Williamson says his journey into law enforcement began when he was 12 years old. He tells me his little sister was killed at the hands of a suspected drunk driver.
She struck my little sister as they were walking to the store. My sister was riding a bicycle. She ran up on the sidewalk, hit her. My sister went up in the air and fell to the ground, breaking every bone in her body.
Ever since then, he made it his mission to be an agent for justice. In 1985, after graduating from Fayetteville State, he got a job as a deputy for the Darlington County Sheriff's Department. 3 years later, he became a state trooper. His work ethic didn't go unnoticed. He soon assumed leadership roles he owes to his father.
They had 12 children. I'm the oldest of those 12 children. So I tell people all the time, my leadership ability and being set to be a leader came from my father, because my father put me in charge of all 11 of my siblings.
Fast forward now to 2016, where his skills prepared him to become the commander of the South Carolina Highway Patrol.
My job is to make sure that along with my director Rob Woods, that I work with him to sit down and meet with our legislators, seek the budget that we need to provide our troopers the proper tools that they need to get out here and do their job effectively.
Colonel Williamson says he understands the responsibility he also has to the community.
And how police officers treat them in their communities. But what's more rewarding when you, as an African American yourself, knowing that you have gone through some of the same things, can go in these communities and show them that not all police officers are bad.
Serving and protecting is what he stands on, and others see that as well. He says being awarded the MLK Drum Major Medallion is a great accomplishment.
It is a great honor when you could follow in the footstep of someone like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. A lot of people get it mixed up, friendly, say he was fighting for the rights of African Americans, but he was fighting for the rights of all people.
Colonel Williamson says each day he comes to work with a winning attitude and stands in awe of leading the Highway Patrol.
How can a little old guy like me from a little old town be involved in such a big deal? That is so unexpected. So my conclusion and my answer is nothing but God. That's it.
And there we have it there, Dr. Shaw, that story on Colonel Christopher Williamson, the first African-American appointed commander of the South Carolina Highway Patrol there. And it speaks to one of the things, Dr. Shaw, in the communities, race relations within law enforcement, things of that nature. What does this say to the community to see a historic appointment like this?
So it's very important. I think in African-American communities in South Carolina and elsewhere, for the law enforcement, for police officers to reflect the community itself and to be represented, and for African Americans and others to be represented in the police force are critically important. Police, I don't need to tell the audience how vital a role the police play in our safety and our welfare and our well-being. And so there's a point of pride to seeing African Americans being appointed to these positions, partly because it also will reflect equity and ways in which police, knowing the communities that they serve, can serve them equitably. Because, you know, we also have a difficult history sometimes of real contention between the law enforcement officials and African American communities, as we know even most recently with the Black Lives Matter protest, etc. And so, again, that's why we have to have public officials, law enforcement included in them, reflect the community that they serve.
You know, speaking of law enforcement, Security is quite high here today, and understandably so, with the vice president in attendance. You can hear the choppers overhead that are offering that surveillance, the aerial surveillance. Number of drones. Yes, the drones just went up, and there are a number of officers here as well. I know a lot of people will want to come to the rally. Be aware of that. Be aware of that as you come here today. If you're watching right now, of course, things will get underway within the next 45 minutes to an hour here at the actual grounds of the State House. If you do intend on coming here, expect that you will have to go through a screening process just to get through the gates at some point, especially if you're coming down in the very near future. There's a lot of security you can't see as well.
Yeah.
That we did.
Oh yeah,
that we saw because we were here very early. But it's so critically important. Something else that is a point of reference here, that you look at the program of today's events. The final speaker, of course, is the Vice President Kamala Harris, being introduced though by longtime, now former Columbia City Councilwoman Tamika Isaac Devine, who made a bit of history this month. Being elected to just becoming the 6th female member of the Senate here in South Carolina. Certainly, she now joins the sister senators as number 6, which they're worth noting on a day like this today too, because the members of the so-called sister senators come from both parties, and they worked together, regardless of party ideology, a year ago to try to challenge a controversial abortion measure at that time. They put the party politics aside and they banded together. So that too is worth noting today, that when people put their minds together and put aside differences, things can be done. But there's some significance too to Ms. Devine being elected to the Senate as well.
It is indeed. It is a bit of a historic moment that you have an African-American woman who's a member of the South Carolina Senate, the General Assembly, who is the first in, or he's not the first, but making some milestones in that position, introducing the Vice President of the United States, who is the first African-American woman of color to be elected Vice President. So in some measures, we should also reflect on the milestones and the movement forward. It's even given the difficulties and the contention of politics, and politics is contentious these days. We should be mindful that, as you stated, there's room for compromise, there's room for coming together, and there's room for and I see sort of at times when I'm looking at legislation and what's produced by the General Assembly, I know there are compromises that are struck by the bills I read. And that's a good thing, that no one has a copyright on truth, and we should all be trying to serve the broader community, children and various other constituencies in whatever we do.
And and that brings us back, we're talking about our local leaders, the state leaders, and then now on a national leader, Congressman Jim Clyburn. I mean, native South Carolina's son. I mean, you say Congressman Clyburn, and it speaks volumes. And Congressman Clyburn, one of the individuals fighting for racial justice as well. As a matter of fact, he actually marched at Zion Baptist Church years ago, and we had a chance to meet up with him on a Zoom call, as we know he's busy on Capitol Hill. And here's what he had to say about his fight for justice.
The American dream is a good dream, but King's dream, it seemed to be needed if the American dream is going to be real for everybody.
Congressman Jim Clyburn stressing the need for Americans to keep Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision alive for all. As many across the state take part in the King Day at the Dome, Clyburn says it's important to not get lost in ideological battles.
I think the thing for us to keep in mind is King's letter from the Birmingham City Jail, when he said to us that he was coming to the conclusion that the people of ill will in our society was making a much better use of time than the people of goodwill.
Clyburn himself understanding what it's like to fight for justice. He recalls being part of a protest that led to a ruling called Edwards versus South Carolina. It all started back in March of 1961. He and other college students from across the Midlands, including a former South Carolina Chief Justice Gene Toole, gathered to make their voices heard.
It was in Zion Baptist Church from which I marched on that morning the last time I went to jail. And it was the most profound experience I ever had.
At the time, South Carolina passed a new law called Breach of the Peace. The congressman saying that the law, among other things, hindered African Americans from protesting publicly about the unfair treatment and the effects of segregation felt throughout the South. He, along with others, were arrested for protesting the law and spent 3 days in jail. A final decision was made in February of 1963 based on the First and 14th Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court found South Carolina infringed upon their group's right to free speech and overturned their convictions. The ruling was dubbed Edwards versus South Carolina. Congressman Clyburn says plenty has been done to address racism, but he believes Dr. King would be disappointed at the state of our nation.
Where do we go from here? He would ask that question, and then he would offer the alternative, chaos or community. That's where we are. Are we going to build a community, or are we going to continue the chaos that exists here on Capitol Hill, all over South Carolina, all over the nation, for that matter? He would ask that question, and I would hope that we would do what's necessary to answer in the affirmative: community.
And back here live with Dr. Shaw. Dr. Shaw, one of the points that Congressman Clyburn touched upon was Edwards versus South Carolina, a very powerful piece of history literally taking place on the State House where they marched around. Highlight that for us, for those who are just coming in to watch this digital special.
So Congressman Clyburn is a historian along with being a congressman, and so he can give you part of it is that he made history, he was part of that history, and that he's a student of history. So in some respects, we also have to remember the young people, the students, various other individuals who push forward the right to protest, the right to speak for free speech. And the ways in which, and we have monuments close to the State House right there on Main Street that will give you a little bit, give you some context to what the ways in which students, particularly students from various walks, the various historically black institutions, were key in setting forward that protest. And so, and they move forward also the legal challenges. And we have to remember that the civil rights movement was just not protest; it was protest that was targeted toward, sort of court cases that would move the law forward and move equity forward in that respect. So there's a bevy of cases within South Carolina, Edwards being among them, the Briggs v. Elliott case being another case we can kind of bring into the mix that have really kind of national implications, although they were right here in South Carolina.
Congressman Clyburn, you say he's a lot of things. He's also can be a political kingmaker. Okay. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. President Biden gives him a lot of credit for the support he picked up here in 2020 on his road to the White House, and again had him back a week ago here in South Carolina in Charleston. Speak to his ability to connect with people and what his word means to them.
Yeah, I think in some respects that Congressman Clyburn is a senior statesman in the Congress and in the nation, in the sense that he's measured, but he is strategic in his thinking as to what he will provide for any administration. And I think the kingmaker ability is certainly that aspect of the fact that his endorsement of now President Biden was key in South Carolina. He tells the story about the elders that came to him and asked him, Congressman, what's your thoughts? What should we do next? And so, in some ways, he's greatly respected because he has waged the fight on so many fronts. There are pieces of legislation today that it was critical for him to be in the House leadership that he was in order for those pieces to be passed. And so in all those ways, he's a kingmaker, but he's also a legislator and a historian, and all wrapped into one.
We can make a very long list.
We
really could. We could.
Yeah. And of course, folks, we getting down to the wire here, where the event here at the State House, King at the Dome, is scheduled to begin in a few moments. You know, we're hearing, and the speakers right directly behind us here, the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King being played, some of the speeches that he's been having. For those of you out that are at home that are trying to figure out if you want to make it here, just know you want to. There's a lot of traffic. We'll tell you that one thing. There's a lot of traffic.
There are some roads that are closed, too,
Yes.
to accommodate the march as it happens.
Absolutely. So if you are making your way over here, as Brian mentioned, roads that are closed, you might want to have someone drop you off a little bit further from the State House just to make your way through. Security is tight. There are several checkpoints for folks who are coming in.
There are, and there was quite an extensive line at one point to get through some of those. Some of those things will probably loosen up as the marchers come in here, probably in the next 20 to 30 minutes, I would think. The march tends to originate there at the church, and people gather in along the way, because I'll tell you, you're not fitting that many people in that church.
Right.
Yeah, that's for sure. You're going to have hundreds of people, and maybe even more this year, because we have such a significant speaker.
Speaking of significant speaker, Dr. Shaw, the Vice President of the United States of America, once again here in Columbia, South Carolina. What should she say that would propel voters or even the Democratic base? We know obviously they're Democrats. So what should she say that would get them to the ballot, to vote once again?
Well, certainly the Vice President is going to connect her words to the legacy of Dr. King, and I'm certain she's going to give some due credit to King and the civil rights movement for the political successes and victories that she had, because if voters couldn't fairly cast a ballot, then there would be a segment of the population that voted for her and President Biden in 2020 who wouldn't have been president. So in some ways she's going to tie to that legacy. But I think she's going to connect and certainly try to connect to the issues that voters care about, and connect a sense of that we're in the fight for you. And I think all candidates on both parties will this will be a year, I think, that voters will be listening to candidates, particularly at the presidential level, saying, I'm fighting for you. Because there are still a range of issues: inflation, the economy, sort of criminal justice reform, education. There are still all these issues, health care, all of these issues that folk and voters are not satisfied with. And so how can she and President Biden fight on their behalf is what she's likely to say.
And regardless of someone's political leanings, just about every one of the issues you just mentioned right there, those are pocketbook issues.
They are.
Inflation, health care, just the general cost of living, all pocketbook issues. So I think anyone who were to be listening today is probably going to take something away from this, regardless of which way they cast their ballot in the coming elections. What do you think?
That's right. And I think in some respects the parties are going to of course, come from very starkly different standpoints. That's the part of the democratic process. The hope is that all of the things that are surrounding the election don't dissuade voters as well. I mean, and I won't go into detail about it, but there are so many things going on and it's sort of difficult at times for voters to be able to get the political information they need to make these choices. And I would remind voters that, of course, this is a presidential election year, but there's a down ballot also that's critically important. And casting your vote for members of various state legislatures matters, I would say, is as vital as voting for President of the United States, because there are so many laws that govern you that are really from the state or local level than is true for the federal level. So in all those ways, there's going to be a lot of noise, but I hope voters are able to have sources of information that help them cut through the noise and make choices for their families.
Dr. Shaw, thank you so much for joining us this morning for this digital special for the King Day at the Dome. We appreciate all your words, the wealth of information over here at
so much.
USC.
I'm always so glad to have you.
Yes. And of course, once again, King Day at the Dome. The events will begin shortly at about 10:30 a.m. We want to thank you so much for joining Watch Fox for this special digital special on King Day at the Dome. I'm Freddie Clairvaux.
Ryan McConkey. We will have a complete wrap-up of this coming up tonight. Our news at 5, which will be digital as well today, and the news at 10 tonight, which you'll see on air and online. But again, we'll be streaming these activities online as well as they are happening here throughout the day. If you'd like to see any of the speakers here today, just stay tuned to where you're watching right now, and that will be coming as soon as those speeches start here at the State House. The weather is holding up. We figured it was going to be sub-zero.
But it's
we came
actually warm.
prepared.
Yeah.
It is a beautiful day. It is a beautiful day. There have been some frigid days for King Day at the Dome. This is not one of them. It is sunny. It is nice. And again, if you're still on the fence about whether you're going to come now, because it's a nice day, right now, yes. and there are a lot of people down here. But again, we were glad to be able to produce this special for you and bring in such a well-informed voice as Dr. Todd Shaw. We're so glad to always have you in any of the programs we do. But thank you again for joining us, and we're going to see you throughout the day. So enjoy.